Hey guys, welcome to the Online Marriage Challenge. This is week 1 and we're going to talk about being intentional in your marriage.
And when we talk about being intentional, it means doing things on purpose with a purpose. You're not going to just fall into a great marriage. It's not going to happen by accident. You have to take steps on a regular basis and be intentional in order to grow the marriage and be the spouse that you're called to be.
Yeah, and if you think about your marriage like a bank account, you have to put in regular deposits so that you have a big, nice, big, burly bank account, because there are going to be those withdrawals, whether they're sudden, like a fight that just comes out of nowhere. That takes a withdrawal. That takes some money out of your bank account when you're referring to your marriage. So it's good to have those deposits on a regular basis, and we're going to talk about what those deposits look like. How can I deposit into my marriage so that I know that it's healthy when when an argument comes up or when I said the wrong thing, it doesn't blow up into this huge argument.
So when we talk about being intentional, there's 3 things that we can do on purpose to improve our marriage, and one is through words. Another one is through our actions, and the third is being intentional with our growth. So let's take a minute to unpack each of those and find out how we can be more intentional.
All right, so the first method on being intentional is with our words. And words are so important, they can really make or break your marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. Many couples haven't really figured out the power of what affirming words can do for your marriage. In fact, we believe that words can either be your most powerful tool or your most destructive weapon.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. But, if we learn how to use them right, they can really empower our marriage, just like you said. So everybody uses their words differently, but let's take a little closer look on how Justin and I have learned to use our words. All right, so 3 examples of being intentional with our words towards our spouse. The first one is directly to them. When I'm talking to Justin, I try to put my words through a filter so that everything that comes out is either encouraging or loving, showing my respect and admiration, and not criticizing and nagging, because we know that doesn't get us anywhere. Secondly is in a crowd, in public. So first is directly, secondly is publicly. When we're out at a dinner gathering, if we're with our friends, we don't do the whole sarcasm. We don't put each other down. We don't try to embarrass the other one, because it sets us up for failure, honestly. So when we're out and about, we're talking positively about each other while we're with each other. And then thirdly, when they're not around. Now this one it's so easy to slip into just talking bad about your spouse when you're at work, because that's what everybody does, right? But we're different. We have to be different. We have to be intentional. We have to be intentional about only saying positive things about our spouse when they're not around, so that if rumor gets back around to them, that they're hearing the good things you've said about them, and not that you're complaining that all he does is sit on the couch and watch sports, or all she does is nag. I wish she would cook better. We're talking positive things so that when these things get back around to our spouse, because they will at some point, that they're hearing good things, and we can avoid a lot of fights and a lot of conflict if we can be intentional with our words.
So one of the ways that I'm intentional with my words is that I use my words to show appreciation. So for those things that Mindy does for me, those actions that she does for me, or when she lines up a babysitter for a date night, I let her know directly that, hey babe, I really appreciate that you lined up a babysitter so that we can have this date night tonight. To let her know that I recognize the things that she does and I appreciate it. Also, what I've realized is that encouraging words are way more motivating than nagging words. When you hear things like, you never take out the trash, does that really inspire you to want to take out the trash next time? No, and if you do it, you're going to do it grudgingly. But I use my words to encourage my wife by pointing out the things that she does really well. I think all of us have areas in which we feel a little bit insecure. And when we lack courage in an area, typically it prevents us from accomplishing the things that we want to do, right? So for Mindy, I take it as my personal responsibility to bring the best out in my wife so that she can be her best self. And the way I do this is through encouraging words. I let her know all the great things that she does well. I focus on her positive. I focus on her strengths. And I speak to her potential. I let Mindy know what I really think about her and the vision I have for her as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, and I uplift her with my encouraging words.
All right, so hopefully that gave you a few ideas on how to be intentional with your words. Now, something that may be even more important than that is what not to say. Now, we've all been hurt or offended by somebody's words sometime along in our life. So it's so important to learn how to put a filter on what you're saying to your spouse and how to make sure that you don't cross that line and say those things that should never be said within a marriage. And maybe you need to come up with that yourselves as a married couple. There are a few words that Justin and I have said, nope, that's crossing the line. Don't ever say this. So that's something that you can come up with yourselves, or maybe you've already done that.
Absolutely. And when you learn how to be intentional with your words, you can truly improve the quality of your marriage. And what's cool about this is you can start seeing improvements this week. This is one of those quick wins that as soon as you can bring your words into check, start using them for you as a tool and not a weapon, you're going to see improvements. Now, this next area of being intentional is probably something we notice pretty quickly if we're not being intentional, because there's evidence of it all over the house. Like piles of dirty laundry and piles of dishes, or I'm leaving my socks all over the bedroom floor.
Or maybe there's no food on the table. Yeah, we're talking about being intentional with our actions, these acts of service that show our spouse that we love them. And it is an area where it's pretty simple to have immediate effect. I've always told Justin he looks way sexier with a vacuum in his hand.
That's right.
Yeah, but the one thing that I hear from a lot of women is I don't want to tell him what makes me feel loved. I just want him to do it out of his heart. Well, let's bust that myth real quick.
That's like not even fair, ladies. Like, seriously, guys, I'm going to throw you a bone here. Women, you cannot expect us to know what you want, because Mindy and I went through this phase where she was expecting me to do things that I just didn't know what were those things that I could do to make her loved, until finally one day I asked her. I said, Mindy, what are those things that if I did for you would make you feel loved, would relieve some pressure, would know that I've got your back? And once we identified the target, like running the sweeper, like doing laundry, like helping with the kids that first hour when I got home, once I understood those things, I knew what the target was, and I was able to show her that I loved her, and we were able to connect in a way that we weren't before.
Yeah, and so the myth is that, if you tell them what makes you feel loved and then they do it, then they're not doing it out of their heart. Well, he was, because he knew that made me feel loved, and he intentionally did those acts to make me feel loved. And I'm telling you what, it did make me feel special, because at that point I knew he's doing that because he loves me and he wants to relieve a little bit of pressure, a little bit of tension. So let's get into our challenge.
All right, so we're actually going to take time right now to take a break from the video, and we're going to write down the 4 things that if your spouse did them for you would make you feel loved. So here in a minute, we want you to pause the video, write those things down, and discuss them, and then come back in a minute.
All right, so now that you've done that, I'm wondering, were there any shockers? Were there any surprisers? I know when Justin and I did that, there were definitely 1 or 2 things where like, man, I didn't know that would make you feel loved.
That's right.
All this time I've been doing these other things you didn't even notice. But now that we have a target, it's much easier to get to that target and to help our spouse feel loved.
Absolutely. And we do have a target now, but I got to throw a disclaimer in here. What you wrote down was not a contract, right? Just because you wrote down 4 things and shared them with your spouse doesn't mean that they are now contractually bound to doing those things starting tomorrow, okay? This is simply painting the target, and you give them something to shoot for. Now, here's the thing. When they do those, it's because they love you, and they're being intentional. And so recognize them for that. And I don't recommend that you turn the list of 4 into 10, but over time, continue to communicate those targets, and as things change, make sure you come back, reset, and have that conversation so that we can all be intentional with our actions.
All right, so the final method of being intentional in our marriage is going to be with our growth. Now we're talking about personal growth and growing as a couple. When Justin and I had our premarital counseling with our pastor, Bennett Smith, he drew a simple triangle on a piece of paper. And he said, Justin, you're at this point in the triangle, Mindy, you're here, and God's at the top in the center. So as you both strive to get closer and closer to God, you're ultimately going to end up closer together as a couple.
Absolutely. And once we get that right, we can look for other ways to grow personally. And for me, there's some resources out there on the web, some different books that I turn to make sure that I'm growing on a regular basis. So it's also important to find ways to be intentional to grow as a couple. So Mindy, what are some ways that we can grow as a couple?
Well, we can learn about our spouse, read about different personality types. What's their personality? How are they wired? How can I best love them based on how they were created? And also, we're going to get into the 5 love languages, and we'll learn what your spouse's love language is and how you can speak their language and not just your own. So these kinds of things, and obviously, pray together, get into some scripture together. There's some great advice in that big book that was made 2,000 years ago, but is so relevant today.
And we've learned a lot together by joining small groups at our church, or attending church together, or getting around other couples who have the type of marriage that we want. Just by learning from them and asking them questions, we've grown so much as a couple.
Yeah.
But guys, let me tell you something. Don't be intimidated by this growth thing. You don't have to be Mr. Perfect tomorrow or the queen of marriage by the end of the week, all right? You simply just have to be intentional by taking a growth step.
Yeah.
Continual growth steps make sure that you continue to move forward in your marriage, which prevents you from moving backwards, right?
Yeah, because it's been said, if you're not moving forward, then you're automatically going backwards.
Absolutely. So first off, we just want to congratulate you guys for taking the growth step by committing to doing this online marriage challenge. Each week, you're taking these videos serious, you're watching them together as a couple, and you're taking the challenge, and you're being intentional with your growth. All right, this week we're going to do things on purpose with a purpose. All right, we learned about the importance of being intentional with our words, with our actions, and with our growth. And the challenge for this week centers around being intentional with our actions. Earlier, we found out what those 4 things that we could do to make our spouse feel loved if we chose to do them. So the challenge is pretty simple. Choose to do them, right? Every day, do something intentional for your spouse to prove to them or to show them that you care about them and that you know how to be intentional.